Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're joined by Elephant Philosophy to discuss contingency arguments. So before getting into, talking about what a contingency argument is, the PSR, different arguments for and against it, as well as some versions of the contingency argument in stage 2, can you first, EP is what I'm going to call you, can you first give us a kind of introduction to who you are and what you do and your YouTube channel?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel on philosophy of religion where I do certain kind of explainer videos and about philosophy of religion. I'm trying to be somewhat impartial, though I'm a Christian, and otherwise I actually badmouth people if they do something that I don't like.
Now we can get into the first topic that we're going to talk about, which is what is a contingency argument. And so can you just take us through what a contingency argument is, and then maybe I can talk about the distinction between stage 1 and stage 2?
Yes, so I think every contingency argument is based on the fact that there are certain, well, facts about the world that may be true, but may not be true. So in this sense, they start from the observation that certain things are contingent. They could have possibly not been. And from this, we infer that there must be some kind of principle that says if a certain thing is possible, is actual, but may not have been, we may have an explanation for that. So from this principle, we get to something that is necessary, that must have been and could not have been otherwise. And then the contingency argument, if this is an argument for some kind of version of theism, then we try to show that this necessary being, this necessary fact that we have arrived at, is something that has some religious significance, I would say.
Okay, good. Yeah, so you were kind of hinting there at the distinction between stage 1 and stage 2. So for the audience, some arguments for God's existence might not have a structure like an ontological argument, but many arguments, like cosmological arguments in particular, have a kind of stage 1, stage 2 structure. So the stage 1 usually adduces some kind of explanatory principle and applies it to some general feature of reality, like the fact that there are contingent things, or that things change, or that there are chains of causation and effects, and so on. And so it reasons on the basis of that general fact in conjunction with that explanatory principle to some kind of explanation for that general fact. And then the explanation is either going to be some kind of uncaused thing, or maybe some not further explained thing, or some unchanged thing, or something like that. And so that's where kind of stage 1 ends. You get to some kind of one or more entities or facts or what have you that provide an explanation for that general fact of reality. So that's stage 1. And then stage 2 tries to take the being that we arrived at, or beings as the case may be. It tries to take what you arrive at stage 1 and then derive various, as you said, religiously significant divine attributes on the basis of that. And you can, like I pointed out in my Leibnizian cosmological argument video, which you guys could check out. I'll put a link in the description, and also put some links in the description to what Elephant Philosophy has done on the Leibnizian cosmological argument and things like that. But as I pointed out in that video, there are a bunch of different ways that you can go about stage 2. Like, you can focus on the explanatory role that the being plays in stage 1 in order to derive certain attributes. You can just do conceptual analysis. You can bring to bear other facts about the effect, like fine-tuning or other sorts of things to infer certain attributes, say, or even evil and other sorts of things. So there's a lot of avenues for, I guess, inferential paths to stage 2. So do you have any comments on like contingency, or maybe here, do you have any comments on what I just said, firstly? And secondly, can you define for us contingent, necessary, and the relevant notion of possibility at play? Because we've just been throwing around these terms.
So yeah, it's not so easy. There are certain different understandings that people have of what it means to be a contingent entity. So broadly speaking, there's modal contingency, where you say, okay, we have this realm of possibility, which we call possible worlds. To be contingent is to exist in at least one possible world, but not in all possible worlds. other people take contingency to me being imperfect in its mode of existence, to not exist in certain ways and do not have an existence that aligns with certain other attributes. But I think what we should first or mainly be concerned about is contingency in the sense of existing in not all, but at least some possible worlds. Necessity is, of course, in a sense, necessity is defined in the same way, broadly speaking. So a necessary entity exists in all possible worlds, but a lot of people take necessary existence to be often a kind of different mode of existence. But this shall not be, at least at first, very important. If we talk about contingency, we are concerned with the fact that if some fact obtains in the actual world, but not in some other possible world, that is just means, say, it could have possibly not obtained. And of course, then we are sort of pressed for an explanation of this fact, right? Because if we allow for the possibility of its non-existence or its non-obtaining, well, then there should be some kind of explanation, right, for this. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that's good. So I guess some final preliminary notes before we go on to talking about the PSR, because you were just hinting at that at the end of what you were saying. So before we go on to the PSR, I do want to talk about some final preliminary notes. So firstly, the relevant notion of possibility at play, right? So we've been talking about well, what we're principally concerned with is metaphysical possibility instead of other kinds of possibility like epistemic possibility. So roughly speaking, for the audience, epistemic possibility, that just means like it might be true for all you know, like the gold box conjecture, right? So
Right.
I don't know whether or not that's true. And, for all I know, it could be true, it could be false. But metaphysically
If it's true, then you would say it's necessarily true, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So we have ontological possibility, and epistemic possibility is really just a restraint on our knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There can also be contingent facts that we do not know to be whether they are true or not, but
Yeah, well, exactly. And moreover, some contingent facts are in some sense like epistemically necessary, like that I exist, for instance. Like I think that has like a probability, at least for me, of like 1, right? And so it's like epistemically certain, and in that sense, it's not even epistemically possible to be false. But yet, obviously, the fact that I exist is not metaphysically necessary. And so these things can come apart, as the Goldbach conjecture thing shows, as certain contingent things show, or my being certain about a contingent truth shows, and so on. And so I recognize a lot of sloppiness on the internet sometimes when it comes to possibility and necessity. So it's good to lay the groundwork as to what we're talking about. We're talking about metaphysical possibility, like out there, genuinely, that thing that we're pointing to, which we're saying is contingent, could have failed to be. It could have not been in reality at all. And so that's the relevant kind of possibility that we're talking about. So that's a first preliminary remark that I wanted to say. And then the second preliminary remark is that, we're going to be talking about possible worlds. And I know you mentioned possible worlds. And so I want the audience to recognize that we're not kind of committing to the like robust reality or concrete existence of possible worlds that are somehow like out there, like island universes or something. But rather, we're using them as a heuristic device. And we're just using them as a way to kind of cash out our talk about metaphysical possibility and necessity. And they
yes, I would also add that possible worlds are grounded by reality. We're not saying that something is contingent because there is a possible world where it doesn't exist. Rather, the fact that something is contingent in this actual world is the fact that we construct a possible world where it doesn't exist. So we shouldn't get the grounding backward.
Yeah, absolutely. And moreover, I guess the audience who are wondering what a possible world is, if we're not kind of committing to their reality, I guess one intuitive way to think about it is just like a complete or global or total way that reality could be or could have been. So, if nothing could have existed, then a possible world or a possible way that things could have been is just blank. It's just empty with nothing, nada. Now we're going to probe in this in this episode whether or not that actually is indeed a possible world, because contingency arguments indeed try to argue for the existence of something that is metaphysically necessary. But I was just using that as an illustration of what we mean when we're saying possible worlds. So
Yeah, and there are some certain problems about there being a set of the truth of all truth or something. Um, there are certain self-referential problems dealing with Cantor's theorem and power sets, and so
mhm,
I think the consensus in philosophy is that the principle of charity should lead us to conclude that probably something like a big conjunctive contingent fact is possible. We can talk about certain atomic truth and make a conjunction of them that properly describes reality, even if maybe not all problems of it are solved already, because self-referential statements or truth about truth may be problematic for this account, but in the light of formulating this argument, one should set aside these concerns and, yeah, probably
yeah.
concede that there is some way to consistently describe a maximal set of facts in this way.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that's a good transition into the PSR, like what exactly we're quantifying over when we're saying that some kind of contingent thing or positive ontological item has or needs to have or possibly has an explanation. And so now let's get into the second part that we're going to be talking about, which is the PSR. So we're going to talk about certain definite definitions of it, ways that you can understand it, firstly. Secondly, some justifications for it, why we might believe it. And then thirdly, some objections to it. And so let's first just like characterize the PSR and the relevant notion of explanation at play. So can you do that for us?
Yes, so generally speaking, the PSR just asserted that every true proposition has an explanation for its truth, but there is the problem, obviously, of what kind of explanation could a necessary proposition even have. So maybe we could, in the first sense, restrict the PSR to contingent propositions. And this is the idea that every contingently true proposition has an explanation for its existence.
All right, so we've got one, so that's one version of the PSR, and that's roughly the one that Proust defends in his 2006 book on the PSR. It's just that every contingently true proposition has an explanation. Now, there are also different versions of the PSR that quantify over different kinds of things. So one kind of PSR will simply say that every contingent plurality of, or every plurality of contingent concrete objects has some kind of external explanation. So that's another kind of version of the PSR that doesn't focus on true propositions, but instead it focuses on one or more concrete things, which is what we call a plurality. It's not, you're not committing to any kind of weird kind of object that's over and above all the individual objects in the plurality, but rather you're just quantifying over them as a group, as it were, as a plural, taking them together. And so this kind of PSR can have some benefits over the PSR on true propositions. I mean, for starters, it does seem intuitive that an explanation of the existence of concrete objects would be in terms of another concrete object, but some people might object to the inference from contingent true propositions having an explanation, that somehow the proposition that explains those propositions must somehow be about a necessarily existent object. And so the PSR that is quantifying over the concrete objects instead of true propositions might actually have an advantage in that regard. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I actually can agree there. There are, of course, I mean, you don't need to necessarily be committed to the existence of propositions in the first place. You can also view them as a conceptual tool to uh,
Mhm.
describe certain states of affairs. So that's first. Yeah, in causal concrete objects, of course, you can say that that it applies to the realm of causally efficient or other kind of things. What I was thinking about actually is, let me get my thoughts together here. Um, yeah, sometimes the formulation references state of affairs, sometimes it references objects, sometimes it references propositions, but the core really is maybe best explained as state of affairs, certain kind of conditions that obtain, I would say.
Yeah. So because I mean, and that's a lot of times the reasoning in favor of, or the justification in favor of one of these kinds of PSRs that it's say quantifies over concrete objects will equally apply to a PSR that would quantify over states of affairs. For instance, like precluding metaphysical chaos, like you wouldn't want an object to be, you wouldn't want your PSR to allow an object to just randomly and inexplicably gain a whole host of properties, say, even though your PSR rules out concrete objects popping into existence, say. And so that's kind of a motivation for, expanding your PSR more towards, say, states of affairs, which would include not only objects as existing and objects as existing at particular times, but also objects as exemplifying various properties and so on. So I think that's another point to consider when we're thinking of what the PSR quantifies over. You also want to think about how your justification relates to your quantificational domain.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's actually another issue regarding the principle of sufficient reason. Its strength and scope. So to say, in modern versions, modern principles of sufficient reason, they state that states of affairs propositions or concrete objects may have an explanation. They actually are concerned with the possibility of explanation in this sense. And for example, Alexander Bruce calls his principle a principle of explanation because the term sufficient is problematic in various ways. Because one may get the idea that a sufficient explanation entails the thing to be explained, and that brings about a whole host of problems that we can maybe later discuss. But we can also talk about a principle of explanation and be humble in this sense.
Yeah. So I remember him saying sometimes he likes to say it's like a principle of adequate or explanation instead of like principle of sufficient reason or principle of adequate reason, something like that. So yeah, we might be able to talk about that later. But for now, I think you're pointing to an important point with respect to the modal register of the thesis, right? So some PSRs say that necessarily every concrete state of affairs or whatever has some explanation. Other PSRs don't take a stance on the necessity of it. They just say every contingent state of affairs has an explanation. And still others merely say that every contingent state of affairs possibly has an explanation. And so I think it's really interesting how you can kind of weaken in a logical sense. We're not saying like weaken as in make it deficient, but weaken in a logical sense the PSR and still potentially get significant results on that basis. So yeah, what do you think?
The question has been that these kind of weak principle of sufficient reason seem to entail stronger principles. So now the question is, if I have arguments against a stronger principle, they should apply to the weaker principle. But since the weaker principle is epistemically modest, maybe we should also reconsider these arguments then in the first place, if they're shown to target also a weaker version.
Yeah, and I mean, just as an aside, that almost points to like the person-based nature of justification, because it kind of depends on how you're coming to the dialectic in the first place. If someone already, say, has independent reasons or is independently skeptical of the stronger version of the PSR, which is that necessarily every contingent fact or whatever has an explanation, if they're already coming to the dialectical context with that kind of background, well then once they find out that the weak PSR might, it depends on the weak PSR, but might actually entail the stronger PSR, they themselves might have reason to reject the weak PSR that someone else who doesn't come equipped with those independent reasons wouldn't have. And so this other person might be well within their epistemic rights and might be well justified in taking the weak PSR on board, even though it would entail the stronger PSR. So it almost kind of depends on your position on the epistemic landscape.
Yeah, since that was Graham Arpey's kind of proposal, we might actually say that if you're talking in the context of theoretical virtues and costs, a rejection of a weaker principle should always be sort of aligned with a greater kind of expenditure when we're talking about theoretical virtues and costs.
That's interesting. No, I like how you say that, because I'm wondering if, I mean, because in taking the weaker principle, right? So let's say that let's just say that we're going to call this person the detractor. They're going to be the detractor of the PSR, and we're going to talk about the theoretical costs, the detractor of the weak PSR. So it sounds like you're saying that because they're denying this weak PSR, it seems as though they're going to have a theoretical cost, because they're committing to, let's say, the impossibility of at least some contingent things having an explanation, say. And that seems to be a theoretical cost. But I guess, like, I'm wondering if it isn't equally theoretically costly for someone who accepts the weak PSR, because once they accept the weak PSR, and once they recognize, or once they, you know, come to agree with the entailment there, that the weak PSR entails a stronger PSR, well, then they thereby, in accepting the stronger PSR, they're thereby rejecting a weak negation of the PSR. You know what I'm saying? Because, like, if they have if they have that strong PSR, which is that, like, necessarily every contingent fact has an explanation, well, then there's going to be this weak denial of the PSR, which is just like, well, listen, it's at least possible that at least some contingent thing doesn't have an explanation.
Yeah.
That's a kind of weak. That's a kind of
we
weak.
have a kind of symmetry there. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can only make progress in actually thinking about why people actually argue for the PSR and why people think they reject it. I think the trend is really going to the acceptance of some kind of humble version of the PSR, because wholesale denial of the PSR brings with it some kind of insurmountable problems that more and more people seem to recognize.
Yeah. So just right before, I know we're starting to get into the justification of it, but right before that, so I want to make one other, or I want to bring up one other point before we get into the justifications, and it is on explanation and defining explanation. So can you take us through how, at least in this context, how you're understanding explanation?
That's actually a very difficult point. So an explanation surely consists in listing a bunch of necessary conditions for for some fact to obtain, in a set with probably trying to get to something like a sufficient condition. But honestly, an explanation does not have to be too strong. There can be an explanation of us two talking here, this that at a certain point, certain elements in the sun formed and laid the groundwork for it, or there can be way more stronger explanations. So I think explanations always refer to some kind of necessary facts for something to attain, and then the strength of the explanation is how many facts, more facts do you add to that.
Yeah, and it's so difficult to pinpoint what we mean by explanation. In one of Okay, so in my video that I did on the Leibnizian cosmological argument, I pointed out that, well, whatever else explanation is, surely any kind of explanation is going to have to remove some mystery. Remove some mystery or other as to why a fact or why a thing obtains or exists or is true. So if you cite some kind of factor or some kind of purported explanation, and you're left equally mystified at why the thing obtained or why the thing in question is true or exists, your explanandum, well, then it seems as though you haven't actually provided an explanation if you are left equally completely mystified at the fact as you were before you introduced that explanation. So what do you think about the kind of mystery removal criterion?
Yeah, that seems to be a personal epistemic kind of explanation that actually, well, if I want to remove some mystery for you, then then an explanation that I give you has to involve some fact that you are not aware of, right? And if we, as a collective, sort of say, explain something to ourselves, such as humanity, then it will necessarily imply that we come to understand some kind of fact that we didn't understand before, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of pointing to also a distinction that I wanted to make here in defining the explanation is the epistemic notion, or the epistemic side of explanation, and the ontological side of explanation. So on the ontological side, we're probably, when we're talking about like explanations, most often in this context, we're going to be talking about some kind of extramental, so like mind independent, explanatory relation of some kind that's obtaining between the facts or between the entities or between the propositions. And so this extramental ontological kind of glue, this connection, this explanatory relation, is oftentimes going to be causation. It might be grounding. It might be realizations, like functional realizations. Some people think that mental states are realized by brain states, or that the universal wave function realizes things within the universe and so on. It might be
I would say it's always a matter of some kind of dependence. And there
yeah.
is, of course, causal dependence, and there's non-causal dependence. Ask yourself, for example, what makes the PSR true if it is true? Well, it cannot be that it is caused to be true by anything. It is rather grounded by the fact that these kind of relations exist. It's true, supervenes upon what is going on in the world. It's not in the same sense that explanation always has to involve some kind of fact. There are different kinds of, an explanation is not always causal. An explanation is not always non-causal. There are certain elements, because we often talk about certain relations that are not concrete if we explain something. And I think in the end, explanation is a non-concrete relation. It's not about finding certain mechanisms in the world, but rather of understanding something globally in this sense.
Yeah. So we've distinguished between the more epistemic side of explanation, which is the kind of mystery removal, the more ontological side, which involves some kind of extramental explanatory relation that obtains. As you pointed out, it's plausibly going to be some kind of dependence relation, whether causal or non-causal, and that could be cashed out, like in realization, grounding, constitution, efficient causal, and all sorts of things. But
by the way, I don't think anybody has ever defined explanation in whatever sense sufficiently for everybody. We haven't explained explanation, so to say.
I think that's 100% true. And Proust points out in a lot of places that we're just gonna have to go with a kind of intuitive understanding of what this is. We all explain things in ordinary life and that sort of thing, and we all kind of have an intuitive grasp on what sort of it consists in, and so we can move from there using our kind of intuitive understanding of it.
Yes, we should highlight the term reasons. We're trying to give reasons for something, and reasons come in such a multitude of forms, and there's such a multitude of understanding of what a reason is. So we probably have to, be humble once again and kind of patch this together a little bit.
Yeah. So for the audience, what we've covered thus far and where we're going next, we covered firstly what a contingency argument is. We talked about what contingency, necessity, possibility are, different kinds of possibility, epistemic and metaphysical. We also talked about possible worlds. And then we talked about the two different stages that comprise contingency argument, stage 1 and stage 2. Then we moved on to the PSR. We just finished talking about what an explanation is. We distinguished between the epistemic side and the metaphysical side of explanation, the two different kind of senses there. We also talked about the kind of domain of quantification of the PSR. So if we're quantifying over true propositions or facts or states of affairs or objects or pluralities or what have you. And then we also talked about the modal register of the PSR, like whether it's actually true, merely possibly true, necessarily true, and the kind of interplay between the weak versions, which play off of possibility and possible explanations, and the stronger versions which play off of the kind of necessity or requirement of explanations. So that's where we've been thus far. We've defined the PSR, we've done that, and now we're going to move into certain justifications for the PSR that people have offered or that maybe EP or I find plausible, and we're going to move into certain objections to the PSR, and then we're going to go into versions of the contingency argument in stage 2. So with that out of the way, can you, EP, just take us through, I guess, one justification that for the PSR that as we've been laying out, and let's just stick with the PSR. Let's pick one that, let's just say, every state of affairs has an explanation, or maybe we could say necessarily every contingent state of affairs has an explanation, and we're going to use contingent state of affairs.
Okay, so everybody who starts to argue for the PSR starts with that it's kind of self-evident, at least for contingent facts. So we are experiencing the world, and we experience us that things have reasons. But we can maybe put this a little bit more in a sophisticated way, where we would say actually that the patterns we observe in the world are uniform and they exhibit certain law-like nature that gives us the idea that necessarily for something to obtain, it obtains because there are objectively verifiable reasons for why it obtains. So from the fact that it is self-evident, we can deduce the fact that it's so self-evident to us because we experience the world. That is sort of the positive approach where you would actually go, look at science. Science operates so well because there are obvious reasons. So if one fact obtains, it obtains for certain reasons, and we can look at these reasons and make predictions on the basis of these reasons. But what I find even stronger is the negative case. We should conceive of how the world could possibly be if the PSR was false. And if you just allow for facts to obtain without any reason, it becomes a little bit too inexplicable for why not just everything can obtain for no reason. You have to kind of understand what kind of mess you're getting yourself into if you allow for facts to obtain with no reason. And certain facts that have obtained can certainly stop to obtain for no reason. Certain facts that didn't obtain can now obtain for no reason. It seems that you cannot ground a reasonable metaphysics that actually explains how we experience the world on the basis of a denial of the PSR.
Yeah. So before getting into the metaphysical chaos, because I want to dwell on that argument further. Before getting into that, I also want to talk about an interesting argument for the PSR developed by Michael Della Rocca. He's a philosopher. He does a lot of work on Spinoza, but he also does work on the PSR. And what he points out, interestingly, is that he looks at a bunch of different philosophical arguments and moves in philosophy, in other domains of philosophy, like philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, evolutionary biology, and other sorts of things, philosophy of science, and so on. And he points out that so many of the common arguments within these fields themselves make use of something like the PSR. Like, people are objecting to other views because those views have something inexplicable about them, or because they have something intolerably arbitrary or inexplicable or unexplained about them. And so what Michael Della Rocca is saying is guys, you guys are treating, if we didn't have something like the PSR, well, then it's not at all clear why this would count as an objection to a view. And he's also pointing out that that there doesn't seem to be any principled reason or principled delineation between demanding explicability in these other domains, like the relation of consciousness and the brain or something like that, on the one hand, and then just contingent states of affairs as such, simpliciter on the other hand. And so if it's like a big strike against a theory that it has an inexplicable link between consciousness and the brain, say, well, then it's equally a big strike against a theory if it has unexplained or inexplicable contingent states of affairs obtaining. So I'm wondering what you think. I know his argument is more sophisticated than that, and it would take me a while to spell it out, but it's really interesting how he points out that all these different arguments in all these different domains of philosophy are like explicability arguments. They're arguments based on views entailing something inexplicable and rejecting the view on that basis. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, reason comes from reason. We reason about something because we want to find out certain reasons for certain states, but even stronger is actually what Rob Kuhn's argued. Rob Kuhn's argued basically that if you deny the PSR, your bodily sensations, everything you hear, everything you see, could basically be a brute fact. In this sense, then it may actually undermine kind of every kind of rational inference that you make, and every kind of normal life things you take for granted could be questioned if you deny the PSR. So in philosophy, I guess, as you say, if you try to reason, you try to give reasons for something, you're trying to have some kind of framework which entails, where there are certain dependence relation, and these are all reasons. They cannot be based on anything that is just brute, right?
Yeah. So let's dwell on this metaphysical chaos argument a little further. So one way that some people try to, I don't want to say try to avoid it, but one way people resist this argument is by saying, well, listen, we don't need a full-blown PSR to get out of these problems. We can take different principles in order to get out of them. So we can say that for instance, every non-first contingent state of affairs has an explanation, say. And so because of that, we know that our psychological experiences, our reasoning faculties, and other sorts of things, these things are obviously not the first events that have ever occurred and the first states of affairs that have ever occurred. And so per our PSR, or per this restricted PSR, we have actually a reason to rule out these kinds of brute, inexplicable chaos of things just like popping into being or something like that, because according to this restricted version of the PSR, those things aren't possible after all. But yet it's not the full-blown PSR, and there might be other ways to restrict it too. And then another way that people respond is by saying, well, hold on a second, like we can rule out these possibilities, like these kinds of like radical skeptical scenarios without a PSR that says that these explanations demand, or that these contingent things, excuse me, demand or require explanation. Instead, we can just say, no, rather there's a defeasible presumption in favor of an explanation of these contingent things. Because if that's the case, well, then what that means is that the burden of proof is actually on the person who thinks that the skeptical scenario is obtaining or can obtain. The burden of proof is on them to give you positive defeaters for your defeasible presumption. And so, once you have the kind of defeasible presumptive version of the PSR, you don't have the requirement of an explanation, but you can still rule out, it seems, these kinds of weird skeptical scenarios. So what do you think about those two responses? The first response was restricted versions of the PSR. The second one is a defeasibilized PSR. What do you think about those?
Well, the first, of course, I think has a theoretical cost in that it makes a crucial exception, right? And you may very well be accused of metaphysical cherry picking a little bit, right? And if we analyze this and think that, oh, well, certain version of the PSR holds, but it doesn't hold for some kind of initial state or for some kind of, let's say, for a limited set of state of affairs or something, I think you're not advocating for a better principle in itself. If we just think about it intrinsically, you're just actually advocating for a worse principle because it doesn't hold globally. It holds with more exceptions to it. And in this sense, I think unless you have, and I guess some people think they have very good reasons for it, we should prefer a global PSR, right? And I don't know if I properly understand your point about the feasibility. Do you think that it's just they're advocating for something it seems to me that they're advocating for a lot of principles that we get out of experience, and they're limited in scope and applicability, and we would need a reason to defeat these sort of these singles or these multitudes of lines of these kind of multitude of patterns that we observe. Is that it?
Yeah, no, that's good, the clarification. So what I was saying there is that, like, listen, I'm speaking for them right now, and so that's what I'm saying, like, listen. So they're gonna say, like, listen, the PSR, as you are formulating it, says that contingent things of a given sort require or demand explanation. And you're saying that without that, we can't rule out these skeptical scenarios, and we can't, or at least we can't say that they're like objectively improbable or whatever, and things could just pop into being or just pop out of being, things like that at random. So you're saying without that kind of PSR that you're saying, which requires or demands an explanation for these contingent things of the given sort, you're saying that without that, we would get metaphysical chaos. And the objector is saying, well, hold on a second. I can debar this metaphysical chaos, or at least I can help us get out of the kind of radical skeptical scenarios that it engenders without your PSR, because I have this other PSR, a defeasibilized PSR, which says not that these contingent things require or demand some kind of explanation, but rather the defeasibilized principle says, all else being equal, we have a reason to think that that contingent things of the relevant kind have an explanation. And so there's a kind of defeasible presumption in favor of the explicability or the presence of an explanation for such facts. And because of that, right, we actually have good reason, we have good justification to think that our experiences and so on are not going to be just this kind of brute, uncaused, radical skeptical scenario, because we actually have a positive presumption against that per this defeasibilized PSR. And what that means is that we can rule out the skeptical scenarios, because after all, no one has thus far thought of a good reason in favor of them. rather the skeptical arguments are just like, you can't rule it out, you know, like, and
But it
so,
seems something like something Keith Parsons has argued, and yeah, there's certainly something to that. Surely, if you just allow for the epistemic possibility of something to happen, and you have certain empirical evidence against it, this surely doesn't commit you to anything then. But it seems to me, if you at least epistemically allow for some kind of brute contingencies to emerge suddenly, then you will still be in a kind of epistemic threat, right? I don't know if you can overcome this kind of threat in this way, because if you just, there's a difference between allowing for it epistemically and allowing for it in the metaphysical sense or in the ontological sense. So you'd still have some kind of bigger problem there, I would say.
yeah, no, I actually think that that's a good response, but I think in the dialectical context at hand, I think, so for the audience, I'm trying to steelman this other position that I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with it. But I think in the dialectical context at hand, we're tackling the epistemic argument from Proust and Kuhns, right? So I think that they're right. I think that while you're right that in the broader context, we would have to like take into account the more ontological side of things, as you were putting it, at least in the context of the epistemic argument in favor of the PSR, on the basis of the radical skepticism, I'm wondering if this objection actually avoids that particular argument, while perhaps nevertheless giving rise to certain ontological problems elsewhere.
I mean, it's a little bit like a skeptical demon scenario, right? And if you allow for the possibility, well, maybe there is a skeptical, some kind of demon or evil genius, as Descartes called it, or if you even allow for there could be, you may very well get into some kind of epistemological mess there, I think. On the other hand, yes, I think that if you take the coherence of the outside world as a reason to think that, yes, this wouldn't be the kind of experiences I'm making, this wouldn't be the kind of world that I find myself in if the PSR were false. Well, but where does this get you actually?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So before we now go on to some further objections, I want to talk about the restricted PSR a little bit further, you know? So I like some of the points you make, like it did seem kind of like metaphysical cherry picking. But also another objection that I find kind of plausible against this kind of restricted or that kind of approach to the responding to the PSR and things like that. Another objection that I find kind of plausible is that this proposal has a kind of internal probabilistic tension, right? So when you say that every fact of a given kind, except this little domain over here has an explanation,
yes.
There is internal probabilistic tension because under your proposal, right, the fact that every contingent thing of this kind has an explanation, that raises the probability that this other contingent fact has an explanation. These other contingent facts have an explanation, right? It raises the probability of it. It makes it more expected. And so if you're saying that, oh, well, these facts do indeed have an explanation, but this other one doesn't, there's a kind of internal, that proviso that makes it
another problem. I
think
think there's another problem. You're saying that only the initial state may be unexplained, but what is the reason for this kind of difference between all the subsequent states and the initial state? What makes it true that the initial state doesn't need this while all other states need this? Is this also brute, or will you commit yourself to an explanation there?
Yeah. So there's that problem of we need a principled explanation for the restriction. And then there's the second problem is that, like, even if they can give us that principled reason, the fact remains that in their proposal, there is internal probabilistic tension, right? Because the fact that the PSR, the fact that everything of a given sort has an explanation gives you reason to expect that other things have an explanation. Like if every penguin but one has a certain feature, that gives you reason to expect that the other penguin has that feature. And so any proposal on which all penguins except for that other one have that feature, that proposal has an internal proviso that makes it less probable than the kind of categorically uniform and more elegant principle that all the penguins have that kind of feature. And
Yes,
so,
so I
so
mean,
even if they had a principled reason for that restriction, their hypothesis suffers nonetheless because it still has that internal restriction, and then that lowers its intrinsic probability.
yes, so if we take into account like Paul Draper's, for the intrinsic probability of a hypothesis, we have modesty and coherence, as I understand them. And coherence is, of course, about the tensions of certain elements of a kind of theory, right?
Yeah, so that's actually, I think he unfortunately named it that because we tend to think, in normal parlance at least, that incoherence is an on or off switch, that something is either incoherent or it's not. It's either incoherent or coherent. But
People think it's binary, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But as Draper defines it in his work on probability theory and that sort of thing, it's more so like a degreed or kind of graded property. That a hypothesis can
This
be
is
more
also
or
an
less incoherent.
epistemic notion because, yes, if we conceptually speaking, rather think it's coherent or it's incoherent, but since we have certain epistemic limitations in exploring these concepts, we can maybe just say these things are in tension, are in some kind of tension, even if we cannot just refute it by that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And so Swinburne, so Draper and Swinburne, they both agree a lot when it comes to the probability side of things. Now, of course, they have some disagreements in their approach, but they're largely in agreement. And the way that they apply this in the case of, for instance, omnipotence is that like intrinsically speaking, if you had a proposal wherein your God has some finite degree of power, the thing is, having that finite degree of power gives you, in your, like, epistemically speaking, it gives you a reason to think, if something has a finite degree of power, that it actually has more power. It kind of raises the probability that it has these other powers if it has these other powers over here. And so there's a kind of internal probabilistic tension when you have like a finite kind of, I guess, posited limitation there with respect to, for instance, your PSR or your the degree of power you're assigning to God, say, or what have you. And so not only is it like more incoherent, there's more tension there. I also want to bring to bear the point that it's less simple because you have to make a further specification. You're saying all these things have an explanation except that penguin, or except the first state of affairs, the first contingent state of affairs. And so not only is there probabilistic tension, but it's also less simple because you're having to add in further information, further specifications into your hypothesis. And so that's yet another theoretical cost of kind of restricting the PSR in this way. So yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question for you. There is a way to get around this accusation of metaphysical cherry picking, which is to say that the patterns we observe and the regularities in the world are something that is true of the world in itself, like, for example, for single states of the world and how they relate to later states. But the problem that somebody could, or the problem, or the mistake that somebody might make is to think these principles apply inside of the world, but they do not apply to the world as a whole. So we are taking explanations and we're demanding meta explanations. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a lot of the responses that apply to what we just said with like the PSR as applied to everything except the first contingent state of affairs. A lot of those problems are equally going to be afflicting this because they're saying everything, the PSR holds for everything within the universe or within the
Exactly.
global reality, except it doesn't hold with respect to the global reality. And
But it
so,
would give an epistemic explanation for why we think that and why the initial state would be different, and this would seem problematic to us, but it's just our mistake because we reason from certain parts of the world to the whole.
yeah, well, okay, so there's a lot that could be said here. So firstly, I do think it will inherit all the problems that we just said with respect to this one, right? So firstly, we need a principled reason for this. And I don't think that, merely pointing out that some instances of reasoning from part to wholes are bad, that doesn't seem to be a principled reason for a restriction to a generalized principle of metaphysics. I mean, we need something further. You need to give us some positive reason as to why you're positing this break in the kind of uniformity or categorical uniformity of explanation. So that's the first thing that I'd say, is that it doesn't seem principled, at least to me. They would need to give some positive reason.
Yeah.
Secondly, I would say that it has this internal probabilistic tension because the fact that the PSR would hold for everything within the universe gives you reason to expect. It raises the probability that it would hold for the universe, just as the fact that some property holds of all penguins except for one of them you'd think that it also holds for that other penguin. So that's the second thing that I'd say. There's internal probabilistic tension. The third thing that I'd say is that that principle is not as simple as mine, or as mine, as the global PSR, because the global PSR is a kind of categorical uniformity across everything. It doesn't have to add in this further specification that, oh, well, it doesn't apply to the whole shebang, and so on. So that's the third response that I'd make. I think the fourth response that I would make is that that just seems it seems to invite
kind of psychologizing, right?
Well,
because a lot of people think that's a great objection to even to like the Kalam or something, to say, well, causality holds inside the universe, but that gives us no reason to think, well, yeah, you kind of asserting that somebody makes a mistake, but you're not actually showing that it is a mistake. It might be one, but it's you're not giving a real positive reason for why that shouldn't apply in that case.
Yeah, I mean, it's not enough. Right, because we never said, we never made the inference because the PSR holds everything inside the universe, it holds for the universe as such. Like, no, we've been talking about precluding metaphysical chaos, we're talking about inductive generalizations, we're talking about self-evidence, we're talking about all these sorts of things. Nowhere have we said, oh, look, the PSR holds for everything inside the universe, therefore it holds for the universe. Like, we haven't done that. And so, like,
so it's conceivable that beings in our state would make that kind of mistake, but that still doesn't show that it's not true and that it is actually a mistake.
Well, yeah, and I mean, just think about it intuitively speaking. Like, some inferences to hold aparts are like obviously fine. They're obviously reliable. So if every brick in the wall is red all over, the whole wall is going to be red all over. And
everybody thinks all inferences from parts to wholes are fallacious because they heard of a certain fallacy, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And when you think about it, you can kind of think about, okay, well, what kinds of properties would be such that they go from parts to wholes? So like if all the parts are red all over and they come to comprise a whole, and the whole is only comprised of them, well, yeah, then the whole would be red all over as well.
It is an inference that is possibly not truth preserving, but that doesn't show that it doesn't preserve truth in certain instances.
Well, yeah, and we can actually reason about which instances would plausibly be truth preserving, and I think that would indeed be the case with something like color, say, but also, I mean, I think explanations, right? I mean, just take the bricks in the wall example, right? Each individual brick is such that has to have an explanation, but so does the wall. I mean, like, you can't just like add more bricks together and those have explanations, and somehow you magically get a wall which doesn't need an outside explanation, right? It seems to me that that's also going to be a kind of part to whole property, as it were.
Yeah, I saw that. To me, it's just psychologizing. It is the conceivability of a psychologically induced mistake taken to be a real kind of objection, but it really isn't. We should think about what makes sense of a whole and not what could possibly be true.
Yeah, well, and also, I mean, it just doesn't. I want to reiterate this. Like, a lot of the arguments that we gave don't rely on this kind of inference. So like metaphysical chaos, if someone is proposing that, okay, well, everything in the universe, those are cool with the PSR, but the PSR does not apply to the universe itself. And I'm just using the universe as the total sum of all contingent states of affairs or whatever. But the thing is, like, listen, like that doesn't avoid the metaphysical chaos thing, right? Because what about metaphysical chaos as applied to whole global states of reality itself? Can those simply just pop into being uncaused, or pop out of existence uncaused, or pop into? That would seem to invite equally much chaos. I mean, like, what would there be other island universes that, kind of just magically spring to be? Would ours magically? Could it just, automatically cease to be, or, these sorts of things? So it doesn't avoid the metaphysical chaos. It doesn't avoid the Michael Della Rocca point, right?
It doesn't explain the distinction in the first place.
Yeah. So there are a lot of problems with this kind of, I guess, internet response that you often hear. But maybe we can. So we've talked about some justifications for the PSR. Do you have any others that you want to cover, or?
No, I think we're fine.
Okay, so now let's go to some objections to the PSR, and then we'll move on to some versions of the contingency argument. So I'll just turn it over to you. Let's start with one objection that you want to cover.
Okay, so we could talk about Peter Van Inwagen's modal collapse argument. And
Sure.
This is actually a very interesting question. It is based on the question how a necessary proposition could possibly explain a contingent proposition. For if the necessary proposition entails the explanatum, So if it by necessity follows from the necessary proposition that some kind of proposition is true, that proposition will obviously be necessarily true, because in every possible world where fact A obtains, fact B obtains, if A obtains in all possible worlds, B obtains in all possible worlds. So the problem is, of course, the necessary proposition would still be true in case the contingent proposition is false. So what do we mean by explanation in this kind? If the necessary fact can still obtain in case the contingent fact is false, well, what kind of explanation could it be?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that is the crux of the argument. Whether explanation requires entailment, and I mean, I don't find that. I mean, okay, so I don't find that plausible as like a demand. Like, explanations have to entail their explananda or whatever. But there you have to admit that there's at least something intuitive about that. Like, you can say, like, does the explanation really remove the mystery as to why the explanandum obtains if you can have the explanation obtaining without the explanandum? So there is something intuitive there that you could at least have to grant him. It's like, yeah, I mean, like, if you're solely citing necessary facts that obtain in all possible worlds, well, like, then how is that explanatorily relevant to some particular contingent fact that only obtains in one or some, but not all those other worlds, even though that same explanation, those same explanatory factors were present in those other worlds, and yet the contingent thing didn't come about. So he does seem to have something going for him there, at least some intuitive plausibility. But ultimately, when you cash it out, I think that, like, almost all explanations that we give don't entail their explanandum. So, like,
I mean, there's some kind of trivial explanation, as I alluded to. I mean, for example, why were we talking? Well, because maybe in the initial state of the universe, some kind of singularity expanded. Is this really an explanation? Yes, it is an explanation, for it is a necessary condition, but how far does it get us? I mean, Spinoza thought that a principle of sufficient reason will give you modal collapse, because for everything there is an entailing reason. So there aren't actually no possibilities, because otherwise, if there were possibilities, reality would be unintelligible to a certain degree, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, like I said, I mean, I think if you just reflect on our ordinary explanatory practices, we rarely cite things that entail their explananda. So, like, why did I get up, or why did I pick this up to get a drink? Because I'm thirsty, right? But that doesn't entail, like, my being thirsty doesn't entail that I get this drink. After all, I could have chosen not to, and so on. But
it's the question about contrastive explanations, right?
Yeah.
Why did you drink something instead of, and broadly speaking, not drinking something? But first of all, not all contrastive explanations do even make sense. I mean, why did you drink something instead of the moon being made out of cheese? Is not a real intelligible question, right?
Yeah, you'd have to add some kind of relevant alternative criterion there. Like the moon's being made of green cheese is not a relevant alternative to my drinking water. Like, so the relevant alternative, and it's really hard to cash out what we mean by relative alternative, but you've got like relevance logics out there and other really complex sorts of things. And but yeah, so you are right that some contrastive demands don't make sense.
Yeah, some of course nonsense, but we could also admit that there are partial explanations. We could say explanation come in different strength, but explanations coming in different strength is kind of a weird concept when we apply it to the concept of metaphysical explanation. Because if we talk about metaphysical explanation, we should talk about sufficient explanation, at least in the fact that we take all factors into account, even if we cannot name them. We just, in principle, talking about all the reasons for why some state of affairs obtains.
Yeah. Well, okay. One other thing that I want to bring up with respect to the Van Wagen argument is that, well, I mean, his particular argument relies on the BCCF, and I mean, I'm quite convinced that you can't have a BCCF because of Cantorian set theoretic paradoxes. So the BCCF, the big conjunctive contingent fact, right? When you have a conjunction, you can treat that like elements within a set. So each conjunct is like a single element within the set, and then the set as such is like the conjunction. And then we know by Cantor's theorem that for any set, the set of the subsets of that set has a cardinality that is greater than the set in question.
Yes.
So I'm gonna repeat that. So we know from Cantor's theorem that if you have some set S, the collection of all the subsets within S, that collection is going to have more members, strictly speaking, more members, more elements than S itself. But with the BCCF, what we can actually do is we can look at the different sub-conjunctions within the BCCF, right? You can
always construct new facts, so to say.
Yeah,
right?
well, and yeah, you can uniquely match, or you can match in a one-to-one correspondence a unique conjunctive fact for each subconjunction of the BCCF, and so then you can create a Cantorian set or a Cantorian conjunction which has more elements than the BCCF, and it can be such that each of those elements within this Cantorian conjunction are themselves contingent propositions, because remember, we initially started with the BCCF and we only took contingent propositions out of there and uniquely corresponded them with another conjunction. And so it follows that each of the elements within the Cantorian set are themselves contingent propositions.
Yes.
They're conjunctive.
And if the BCCF is a contingent proposition, you would have a proposition that asserts more than it actually contains.
Yeah. So that's where the paradox is, right? So the paradox is we actually just constructed a conjunction with all contingent. It's a conjunction of contingent propositions inside of it. All the propositions are contingent. That's the Cantorian proposition that we just constructed. So it's a construction of. It's the BCCF, essentially. We just concluded that there's a BCCF with more members than the BCCF itself. So we concluded that there are more contingent truths than there are contingent truths. That's essentially what we just did.
You have to really restrict it to some kind of atomic propositions, and you have to kind of rule out then the reconfiguration and then creating new conjunctions. But the problem is that you cannot really do without this kind of self-reference, because you still want to say that the BCCF is true. And if the BCCF is true, it's contingently true. And if the BCCF is contingently true, it has to include first and foremost the proposition that the BCCF is true.
Yeah.
So your restriction is in danger there, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to even assert the truth of the BCCF.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I like. So all these paradoxes with the BCCF, like I don't like versions of the of the Leibnizian cosmological arguments from contingency in general that appeal to the BCCF. That's why I would like to say, like every collection of contingent states of affairs or wholly contingent states of affairs has an explanation, and you can avoid the BCCF worries because you can just deny that you can take arbitrary subcollections of these states of affairs and somehow combine them to a further state of affairs. You can deny that because not every arbitrary sum actually amounts to a state of affairs. So
yeah, but you have to take this into account for the maximality, because that is the BCCF. So your intention there, definitely.
Yeah, well, I think it depends, because the BCCF is automatically a contingently true proposition, and so it's included within itself. But the collection of wholly contingent states of affairs, that doesn't automatically amount to itself being a contingent state of affairs. It's just a collection of the contingent states of affairs, and so it seems as though you can avoid the kind of self-referential. What do you think?
Yeah, you probably could. Yeah, I just think that the principle of charity may somebody to accept that we can construct something like a BCCF and reason from there.
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, there are different ways to get out of it, and you can.
This is of course the old problem of the truth, or the set of all truth, right? Truth,
yeah.
Create truth, and Howard Sobel in Logical Theism argued this way against omniscience. Actually,
yeah.
Yes, and not really against omniscience, because he allows for some kind of omniscience, where God is not really aware of all kinds of nonsense truth that arise out of its own knowledge, sort of kind of a loose awareness. Or you could still say, if there is a proposition, so God knows the truth value of it. He doesn't have to be aware of the truth of all propositions. Rather, it's impossible for there to be a proposition of which God does not know the truth value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, there are also some other fun paradoxes of omniscience. You know, there's the one where it's like, consider all and only those acts of knowledge that are not about themselves. So, you know, acts of knowledge which are non-self-intentional, they aren't about themselves. So I have an act of knowledge. I know that unicorns don't exist. Well, that little bit of knowledge is not about itself. It's about the non-existence of unicorns, say. But some acts of knowledge might be about themselves, like if you reflect on your own mental states or whatever. But if you consider the knowledge of all and only those non-self-intentional acts of knowledge, well, this piece of knowledge itself is either self-intentional or it's not. If it's self-intentional, then it's non-self-intentional, and if it's non-self-intentional, well, then it is self-intentional. And so you get a kind of paradox. So that's also a fun one to think about. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting caught up. So okay, so that's the modal collapse argument against the PSR. How about we tackle another one, another objection?
Okay, so if I think about it, if we're talking about the Gale-Proust argument, but in general, I mean, do you want to talk about the principle of sufficient reason of BCCS, or do you want to talk about the Gale-Proust argument in particular?
I don't quite care. We can just move on to. Okay, so we'll move on to some versions of the contingency argument, and let's just lay out just some of the land of the space of possible arguments. So you just pick whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, we can start from the Leibnizian version. And the Leibnizian version, I think, was motivated by the fact that if you say that, okay, every state of affairs has an explanation, there was this kind of Humean reply, I think, that, okay, we'll just make it infinitely many states of affairs and they in turn explain each other. And well, voila, we have every state explained, and we don't actually need to get to something like a necessary being or something like that. But the problem, of course, is that there is a kind of meta-truth about this. The meta-truth is that there are contingent beings in the first place, or that there is this chain, this infinite chain of contingent beings in the first place. Then the original Leibnizian argument, I think, poses the question, what explains contingency in and of itself?
Yeah, and you know, Leibniz himself. Well, I mean, Leibniz was clearly aware of this kind of objection. He gave the example, I think, of what was it, the geometry books or whatever. So it was like, if one geometry book is like, it exists because it was copied from another geometry book, and then why does that geometry book exist? Well, because it was copied from another geometry book,
so
and so on.
The turtle's all the way down, right?
Yeah. Well, like if you're just like, you don't really have an ultimate explanation of why there are these geometry books if you're just like citing, oh, well, this geometry book came from that other one, and then that geometry book came from that other one via copying or whatever. Like, you don't have an ultimate explanation. You don't even have an explanation of like why there are these geometry books at all. And it also doesn't even seem as though you've sufficiently or adequately accounted for the final one, because you've kind of just infinitely deferred the explanation.
Exactly.
It's been copied off of those other ones, but like, if it's an infinite string of copying, what? That's like an infinite number of IOUs, you know? It just doesn't make sense.
Just think about it in a modal sense. So let's say the existence of some geometry book necessarily implies the existence of the next geometry book. Well, then the modal status gets ever more inferred, right? So if they're all contingent, they're surely all contingent. If they're all necessary, they're all necessary. So by giving this kind of chain of entailing books, in the sense, you not have actually answered the question about their modal status. So in the end, you have deferred this kind of explanation till infinity, but you've never solved it. So would there be then a world without these geometry books, or would there not? You cannot answer this question on the basis of geometry books.
Yeah, well, what if the book was such that the first inch was one page, and then the second half inch was the next page, and then the fourth inch, and then what's the last page? No, I'm just kidding. That was a terrible joke. Oh my gosh. The Benedetti Leibnizian argument.
Benedetti. Yeah, no, I just think that that's what actually in the Russell and Coupleton debate come up, and yeah, I think what did he say? You can line up chocolate till infinity, you never get a sheet or something. I don't know. Yeah, that's actually, I think, because it's a pseudo attempt to fulfill the principle of sufficient reason without actually doing it. And if you talk about the matter state, you will have to find an explanation. If you deny the explanation there, then why have you given us this infinite chain in the first place? Well, because you saw there's a necessity of providing explanations. But now that you have constructed the infinite chain, you're not willing to go one step further, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And, this goes back to what we were saying about the PSR holding for everything within the universe, but not the universe itself. A lot of the things that we said there are equally going to apply to this kind of Humean response to the basic Leibnizian cosmological argument, seems to me.
And that has been argued, I think, by William Rowe. Even an infinite collection or an infinite composition, if you have this infinite body of certain parts, it doesn't tell you why the parts are arranged in the way they do.
Yeah. Okay. So you're talking about like the character of the parts themselves, because like we were talking earlier about how we don't only want a PSR that only disallows metaphysical chaos with respect to concrete objects popping into existence. We also presumably want to rule out them just randomly coming to have properties and like gaining and losing.
Yes.
So that also goes back to that. Okay, so that's a kind of basic, I guess, Leibnizian version of the contingency argument. Maybe I can spell out a kind of basic Proust-Rasmussen kind of contingency argument. So they, I think, in their book Necessary Existence, they essentially, well, they give a lot of different arguments, but they start off with a kind of basic one. And the basic one is, I mean, this is straining my memory, but it's something along the lines of every plurality of contingent concrete things as an explanation, and then you can take the plurality of all contingent concrete things, and per that principle, that's going to have
It possibly has an explanation. So go from that it only can be necessary facts and explanation, then you have this kind of modalized 5 logic whereby possibly some necessary explanation exists, and then
so in the beginning of their book Necessary Existence, they just give the kind of basic Leibnizian one where they don't do the possibility operator, but then they go on. So that's where I was actually headed after I was going to articulate this one, and I was going to ask.
Okay.
Yeah. So this one is every plurality of wholly contingent things. So like the plurality is only containing contingent things. So every plurality of contingent concrete objects has an explanation, but you can apply that to the plurality of all contingent concrete things, and so that plurality itself has an explanation, but the explanation cannot be in terms of any contingent thing because, well, I mean, then it would be a circular.
Self-explanatory entirely.
Yeah, because you'd be citing one of those very contingent things in order to explain why there are those contingent things. And so it would ultimately kind of pull itself up by its own metaphysical bootstraps, as it were. You get a kind of circular explanation there. And hence we have to cite something necessary that explains or accounts for the existence of the plurality of contingent things. And so that's their kind of basic argument. And then they go on to give certain modalized arguments, which are really interesting. And so now let's talk about those. And so I'll turn it over to you to spell out, I guess, at least one modalized version.
Yeah, they do something similar that Gale and Proust did. They say every wholly contingent state of affairs possibly has an explanation. And they kind of move on to this, that every maximal state of contingent facts possibly has an explanation. And then they state, surely the same thing again cannot be a contingent thing, because that would in turn fully explain itself. And that is seen as incoherent. So if we then think, okay, only necessary fact can explain this maximal set of contingent facts, well, then we have basically asserted that possibly there's a necessary explanation, which means possibly there's a necessary fact, which of course means that necessarily there's a necessary fact, which means in the actual world, if that is true, there will be a necessary explanation of these contingent states of affairs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's one modalized version. There are lots of other modalized versions that are interesting too. So some of them apply to types, right? So you can ask, well, what explains, well, we can ask for an explanation of why there are any instantiations of the type contingent thing. And
Yes.
I mean, like, it seems very, very, very obvious that an explanation of why there are any instantiations of the type contingent being cannot itself be in terms of a contingent being, because it would already be instantiated. It would already have to be instantiated in order to explain why there are any instantiations of that type.
The big elephant may explain all the little elephants.
Yeah, exactly.
But surely elephants are not the explanation for the existence of elephants.
Yeah. So I think that's a good, that's like a really clear way to put the kind of circularity problem, is just putting it in terms of types of things, like turtles, right? What explains any instantiation of the type turtle? Why are there any instances of that? Well, you can't cite a turtle because then you literally cite it. The instantiation already took place if you're citing it in terms of a turtle, and hence you're literally presupposing that thing.
Explanation of types have to appeal to some kind of fact that is not in that set of the type.
Yeah, because then it would already have to be instantiated in order for those things to explain it.
That's actually an interesting point about explanation that we actually omitted, right?
Yeah, the irreflexive. So I tend to think that explanation is entirely irreflexive. That's controversial, and there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of disagreement here as to whether or not explanation.
Libertarians about free will sometimes hold that something about the will is self-explanatory, because if I will something, what kind of explanation could it be? Well, it's just that I will it. And some people find this utterly bizarre. I think it actually makes some sense, but because if I will something, I'm impressed by some kind of reasons, but in the end, why I'm impressed by these reasons? Well, because I will, so right? They are the expression of my will, so.
Yeah, well, I think action theory, that's going to get us way too bogged down in the weeds. So we can set that to the side. But that is another thing. You're right that there's an open question to be had as to whether or not explanation can be irreflexive. So that just means whether things can explain themselves. I tend to lean towards thinking that they cannot. I tend to think that that's not coherent. But that's at least controversial. There are able philosophers on both sides of that. So.
That's another argument from the Modal Argument from Beginnings.
No, I actually really wanted to cover this one. So
I did. I think it's kind of good.
Yeah, I have an interesting objection to it, but I want you to you spell it out, and then I'll give my objection.
The way I actually think that every kind of initial state possibly has something that brings it about, and but every kind of initial state is contingent, of course, and if this kind of contingency is to be explained, of course it is explained, so we're not deferring it infinitely, but something that is necessary. So we're talking about the beginnings here, then we say that every kind of contingent beginning has a necessary cause or explanation. I think they frame it in terms of straightforwardly in terms of cause there.
Yeah. So as I understand it, like when Josh developed it, it's something like the beginning of the instantiation of a property when the property in question is contingent. So that possibly has an explanation. Okay, that was rough. I'm just going to restate that. Every beginning of the instantiation of a contingent property is possibly explained. Possibly has a cause.
The strength is, of course, because it does begin, right?
Yeah.
So we need some kind of explanation, because otherwise the term beginning in some sense implies, in some sense, really contingency by itself, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that is contestable, but it does.
It's intuitive, at least.
Yeah, it is intuitive. Yeah. But so that's the kind of first premise, that every beginning of the instantiation of something contingent possibly has a cause. And then you can actually say in your next premise that it's at least possible that there is a beginning of the type contingent thing. And so then you move to that possible world where there is a beginning of the type contingent thing. And so in that possible world, we apply that principle, and it says that in that possible world, that beginning possibly has an explanation. And then you move to another possible world where it does have that cause, does have an explanation or cause. And the cause, of course, must be a necessary cause, because this is the beginning of contingency itself, right? And so
the kind of accessibility there is very, very intuitive, I think.
Yeah. And so I guess we moved to this possible world, and then we said in that possible world it possibly has an explanation. So then you have to move to another possible world, and then in that possible world we conclude that a necessary being exists. And by S5, all possible worlds are accessible from all other possible worlds. In which case, this necessary being is possibly necessary, and hence it's necessary. You can get to a necessary causally efficacious, at least one necessary causally efficacious thing by means of this argument. Now, I do have an interesting objection to that. So I think if we take an Aristotelian view of modality, right, where possibilities branch off from the actual world, and so it's a kind of
powers too. You mean
it's a causal view. It's a causal view of possibility where something is possible if and only if it's either actual or it can be produced by the outworkings of the causal powers of actual things. And so if you have this view, well then actually this modal argument for beginnings isn't so modest, because in that claim that it's at least possible that contingency has a beginning, right? That claim under an Aristotelian view of modality, I think, actually entails that strictly entails that contingency actually does have a beginning, and necessarily, it necessarily does have a beginning. And so it's not as modest as you think it is. You're asserting, it's like the modal ontological argument. You think you're asserting that just possibly God exists, but you're actually committing yourself to the necessary existence of God. And similarly, if you take an Aristotelian view of modality, you're not just asserting the possibly contingent things, or the type contingent things is possibly beginning. You're asserting that necessarily in every possible world in which contingent things, if they come to be, in every possible world in which they come to be, they have a beginning. In other words,
sort of larger problem, right? If omnipotence is the ability to bring about any possible state of affairs X, but a possible state of affairs X is just what can be brought about from some initial necessary being, it becomes kind of circular, right?
Yeah, well, I think that would be circular, but I think I'm hinting at a different problem, because under the Aristotelian
I see, but there's a certain symmetry to that.
Yeah, I mean, like in the case of the Aristotelian branching view of modality, right? You have to think, like, if the world. So you start with the assumption that suppose that the world is in fact does not have a beginning of contingency, in which case contingency stretches back all the way back, causally at least, maybe temporally, but at least causally it stretches all the way back. There is no beginning of contingency. Well, then it's actually impossible under an Aristotelian view of modality that you could have a beginning of contingency, because a beginning of contingency could only branch off from one of these causal nodes. But per hypothesis, you can't have a branching off of an infinite node such that that branch off is the first branch of the kind of thing that you're talking about. Okay, so let me reiterate. I'll talk about.
No, I understand.
Well, I want the audience, dude. I want the audience.
The whole notion of modality is actually sort of if you accept this kind of notion of modality, you're actually begging the question against somebody who may deny the argument, because in some sense the argument is actually already entailed or already included by your view of modality. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, so I'm explaining this to the audience because I recognize that it's kind of a difficult thing to explain. So let me use the example of penguins, okay? So we're going to suppose that in the actual world, penguins don't have a beginning, okay? So it's penguins all the way back perhaps into an infinite past, or if the past comes to an end, then it's at least penguins are somehow causally prior to other penguins. but we're going to suppose that, at least temporally speaking, it's infinitely far into the past, and it's penguins producing penguins all the way back. Now, under an Aristotelian view of modality, it's actually impossible for there to be a beginning of penguins on this view, I believe, because again, under the Aristotelian view of modality, the only way that something could be possible is if it's actual or if it's produced by the outworkings of the causal powers of actual things. And in that case, a beginning of penguins isn't actual because we assumed that there's an infinite stretch of penguins,
Yes.
but also it can't be produced by the outworkings of actual things because it's already actually and eternally the case that there is an infinite string of penguins. And so it's not as though you can have one of the penguins in this chain making it be the case that penguins begin, right? Or anything else making it be the case that penguins begin, precisely because that's not how you can have an outworking of actual things if indeed penguins go back all the way. And so you can apply the same thing to contingency, right? So if contingency goes all the way back infinitely in the actual world, well then, under an Aristotelian branching view of modality, it's not possible for you to have a beginning of contingency. So I'm gonna have to flesh that out a little bit, more precisely if I were to like write it down. But I do think that the argument is not as modest as it may appear if you bring in this Aristotelian view of modality. It's like the modal ontological argument. It's like if you're asserting that contingency possibly has a beginning, you're like ipso facto asserting that contingency actually begun. And that's precisely what they want to avoid in this argument, because they want to, it's a modal argument for beginnings. They want to make it like modest, right?
Yeah, sure. So that's a point. But I was also thinking about the just the modal argument from contingency, because sometimes it is argued that we have some kind of modal intuitions about the possibility of this vast array of contingent possibilities. Just think about David Lewis, who thought that basically everything is possible. In this sense, then, they would say that sort of like God, a being with libertarian free will, is the best account for all these wonderful things that are possible, because he could really bring them all about. And if you have a non-personal necessary being, you're restricting possibility. But the problem then is, if what you think is possible is actually already entailed by what kind of initial necessary being you have, you're kind of getting it. You think that a lot of things are possible because of the initial state, and then you say, therefore, this is the initial state, but that initial state was actually the reason for your intuitions. So if your intuitions are grounded on something, they surely are grounded on what you think the initial necessary being is and what kind of causal powers it has. So that actually informs your modal intuitions. So you cannot actually, in this sense, non-question beggingly assert that your modal intuitions actually favor God in this sense or something.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point. Like, it's almost like, so I've thought of this in the context of the modal ontological argument as well. So like, it's almost like if you already have in place your theory of modality and you're already, say, a naturalist of sorts, well then like you already have independent reason to reject these kinds of, appeals to conceivability or those other sorts of things, precisely because it just falls out of your modal theory that these things aren't possible. Like you were saying, it's almost like they're putting the cart before the horse, and you can't like non-question beggingly just like assert that these wildly conceivable things are indeed possible, precisely because that's delimited by what you already think is the case with respect to
Yes.
The actual modality, the theory of modality, and the actual initial state or whatever.
And if you think of metaphysical possibility in terms of broad logical possibility, you're now accepting every kind of nonsense, right? I mean, if it's sort of, what is it about provability? I mean,
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think that way more caution about our modal claims is in order for philosophers, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, my opinion is sometimes that the broad logical view of possibility may be correct if we would really understand all the concepts involved, and then we'd see that the realm of logical possibility is actually much smaller than we initially may think.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that would almost like require us to be like omniscient, like
Yeah,
But
think of an infinite intellect. Couldn't he just, this is very rationalistic, but if an
yeah.
infinite intellect would find itself in the world, could he just reason everything out from the get-go?
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I guess one way to put this is like, would there also be a posteriori necessities for an infinite intellect?
Yes.
Yeah,
Or
that's
would he
interesting.
just, by contemplating the concept of existence, which he can't deny, and from there deduce everything because everything is in some, and would this imply a modal collapse?
Ooh, well, yeah, that's interesting. Well, we've covered some versions of the contingency argument, and for the final section of the video, maybe we could just go on to stage two. Just talking about certain inferences and certain inferential paths in stage two. So I'll turn it over to you. Where do you want to go with this?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to ask you what you think about what actually constitutes a necessary being, or what makes it true that a necessary being exists. And then there is some kind of confusion at stake here sometimes. You certainly do not really believe that a necessary being exists due to the necessity of its own very nature, because I hold it that you think that the nature of a certain entity cannot really be the explanation for its own existence, because surely it has to exist to instantiate any kind of properties. And well, if it already exists to instantiate a property of necessary existence, well, if existence is in this sense logically prior to the instantiation of other properties, well, then this doesn't really make sense, and this doesn't really explain anything. You take its existence first as kind of brute, and then you infer from that by some kind of properties that it has to exist, and then, well,
Hmm. Yeah, well, this is difficult because it almost depends on our what we take existence to be, because certain views don't have existence as a property, other views have it as a property. Um,
but
most
there are
views most
most
views have
views have.
necessary
I
existence
mean,
as a property. Um,
yes, but some views have it as a mode of existence too.
yeah, I don't even I barely know what mode of existence means, but we could set that aside. But so yeah, in terms of explaining the necessity, like this is sort of at the edge of my own thinking, right? I mean, so like, what's his name? I think it's a philosopher by, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but it's something like Tien Chun Lo or something, and he has an article. It's like
Heard of
2019 or
him, yeah.
2020 in Analysis, and the journal Analysis, that is. And he argues that you can have a kind of Aristotelian modal explanation for the necessity of the being in question. He says that you can say, once you have an Aristotelian modal theory of, or Aristotelian theory of modality, you can explain the necessity of something by saying that, well, it's actual, firstly, and secondly, because actuality is prior to, for Aristotelians, actuality is prior to like everything. So you say, firstly, it's actual, but secondly, nothing exists with the causal, nothing actual has the causal power to bring it about that this thing never existed or will eventually cease to exist. So you're
Yeah, I heard of
citing,
that.
yeah. So you're saying that nothing has the causal power to prevent it from existing. Nothing has the causal power to bring it out of existence. And nothing has the causal power to make it such that it never could have come into existence. And in that case, via the Aristotelian view of modality, you can, so this person argues, you can secure and explain its metaphysical necessity. Now, I guess one of my explanations, which I don't think they sufficient, or one of my reservations with that they didn't sufficiently address in the paper, was that like, but why? Like, why firstly is this thing, why is this actual in the first place, right? I mean, sure, you could say that like it's actual and nothing has the causal power to make it such that,
It's a partial explanation,
yeah,
sure.
I mean it is, but also I also want to say, like, well, hold on a second, like, why doesn't there exist something that is able, has the causal power to bring its
Yeah,
existence about, like, like, what explains that? Like, I don't know, I just feel like we're
I
coming
think.
close to the ultimate stopping point, and at
Yeah, I think
some point you
everything
throw up
is
your hands.
bad when you talk about the existence and you invoke the idea of nothing prevents it from existence. You are really trespassing in some very dangerous territory.
Yeah, well, it might become more plausible when you conjoin the Aristotelian theory of modality. And again, I'm not sure if, So it's been a long time since I read that. That was published in like 2019, and I remember reading it really early because someone was like, "Hey Joe, this is super important for your interest," and I'm like, "Oh, so this is like I read this maybe a year and a half ago or something." So it's been a while or something like that. But I'm not sure if they put it in terms of preventing, but I do remember that they explained it in terms of nothing has the causal power to bring it about that this thing doesn't exist, and secondly, yeah. So I mean, again, like I said, I think we're coming close to the ultimate stopping point where you just throw your hands up and say, "It just is that way, man." um,
Yeah.
I mean, just think. Well, one point that I want to make is that, like, I don't know. It's always seemed to me that the same is always going to be applying to God's existence, right? I mean, you might cite perfection, but God's going to already have to exist in order to be perfect. You can't be perfect if you don't exist to be perfect in the first place. Similarly, like you were talking about necessary existence and other sorts of things, like it just seems to me that every view is going to have this kind of problem.
I see a problem there in the way classical theists deal with this issue. I always say, I mean, God's essence and existence is the same thing, but they always assert that God exists in a different mode of existence. But this cannot be. In what kind of existence do you talk about, right? The notion that some essence is identical to its existence is incomplete if you allow for there to be different modes of existence. So you cannot say existing, the essence being identical to the existence is a different mode of existence because you just use the term existence. So you put in the problem step back in this sense, because is the essence identical to this kind of mode of existence? I mean, this to me seems a little bit problematic.
That's interesting. That almost goes. So I know there's this philosopher.
So what kind of existence is the essence identical to the superior mode of existence? But the superior mode of existence is supposed to be necessary existence already.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your argument there almost reminds me of a contemporary philosopher, metaphysician. His name is Scott Berman. You might have heard of him. He defends Platonism, a kind of contemporary analytic Platonism, and he's been on Alex Malpass's show, Thoughtology. And he presents like an argument against the thesis that being is not a genus, and he argues that, like, well, in what he asks, like, in what sense of exists are we applying this to the 10 categories where existence is not one among those categories, and if it isn't applied univocally across them all, and like he gives an interesting explanation. What you said there reminds me of that, so I'm just pointing listeners to that discussion on Alex Malpass's show, Thoughtology. But yeah, I just wanted to make that small point there. But okay, so maybe we could talk about other stage 2 inferences. So where do you want to go next?
Yeah, so if we talk about limits, and I'm not that comfortable talking about limits because I don't think the argument is all that good. I just have this kind of question: if there's a necessary entity, can it have accidental properties? So it seems that it essentially is necessary, so its essence has to exist. But if it has non-essential properties, then I think these non-essential properties obviously have to kind of flow from its essence. So it has to have, in this sense, some kind of essential property that I think indeterministically assigns itself some kind of property that then is non-essential. I find this a little bit hard to swallow.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I don't quite share that intuition. So let's put a concrete offer on the table. So let's focus on the neoclassical theistic God, right? So this God does indeed have essential properties. They're all necessarily existent, precisely because they're essential to God, and God is necessarily existent. But God also has certain accidental properties, like they're going to want to say freely willing universe.
Broadly across the scale, right?
What'd you say?
No, it applies broadly across the scale. I think everybody has this problem, right?
Well, yeah.
And if we say there are some epistemically unattainable necessities, well, anybody can invoke those, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was just wondering, like, if neoclassical theism can provide some explanatory resources to remove some of the mystery as to how God's essential properties can account for some of his accidental properties. Like, I mean, consider, for instance, that God, being essentially rational, being essentially perfectly rational, being essentially omniscient, he's going to be aware of all these sorts of different reasons for acting, and so on. And so these reasons are plausibly going to be sort of part of his very nature, as it were. And so his contingent accidents, which might be his various acts, like freeing the Israelites and creating the cosmos and so on, those can actually be explained by portions of his essence, as it were, namely his reasons, his desires, the strengths of his reasons, the strengths of his desires, and so on.
Yes, yes. It seems like contra-causal free will has some kind of, there's something to that, but this is certainly, in a sense, indeterministically, but it's still kind of intentional. So I wonder if somebody who denies God's existence, who wants to have a non-personal necessary being, I have some kind of problem with this kind of state, because this is just the initial state, and it has to kind of assign sort of these kind of properties to itself sort of initially. That means simultaneously. So it's in some sense almost a self-determining essence, right?
So it seems to me that they can give kind of analogs, just analogs to the case of, say, neoclassical theism, but that just don't invoke a kind of libertarianly free action. It's just an indeterministic mode. You know, like in quantum mechanics, say, it's just a kind of non-personal indeterministic thing. And so they can explain in place of the reasons and the desires and those sorts of essential properties that are playing the indeterministic explanatory role in the case of the neoclassical theistic God. I think the proponents of the impersonal view of the indeterministic foundation, or the foundation that indeterministically gives rise to its effects, they can say that it has certain essential properties which are such that they indeterministically factor into the explanation of the, you know, the contingent accidents and the contingent acts of this impersonal foundational necessary thing. And there might be, you know, like we have like sophisticated theories of quantum mechanics and what those probabilities consist in, and at least Aristotelian philosophers like to say that they're grounded in the natures of the things in question. That's why they have a kind of intelligible structure to them. That's why they consistently manifest a probability of like 10%, say, instead of being all over the place. And so, you know, there might actually be some explanatory resources here.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, because essentially the thing first has to exist to assign itself some non-essential properties. So does it have these properties in its initial state? Does it cause these properties to have them simultaneously? I'm not quite sure of this, because yeah, it seems weird, so to say, because once again it's the same kind of problem. We can say that the kind of essence is sort of the property bearer of some non-essential properties, but it also has to kind of be the reason, at least indeterminately, for to have these properties.
Yeah. I mean, it would depend if we take. I mean, it depends if we think that this thing is timeless or temporal and so on.
Yes.
But I guess, I guess I'm not quite.
I mean, the essence sort of grounds then these kind of properties, but I wonder how this fits with kind of more scientifically minded view of it.
Yeah. Well, I do think that we're going to have a kind of metaphysical account of what the indeterminism consists in, right? I mean, like, again, like I was saying, like the Aristotelian philosophers who are looking at quantum indeterminacy, they're going to say that these kinds of indeterministic, probabilistic propensities are grounded in the nature of the thing in question. It's because it has certain essential characteristics. It is in virtue of those that it has the kind of indeterministic propensities that it has, and gives rise to certain accidental properties that it does or has, and so on. And so, I mean, I agree with you that it is a little weird, but I just feel like it isn't.
Oh, you said one's a problem for everybody.
Yeah, and it is a problem for everyone.
Much a problem, right? Yeah, it is a problem for everybody. And some people say, well, God is triune in nature, so to say. Well, I think if you're a Christian, you do think that this is, of course, some necessity, but appealing to sort of unknown necessities, of course, then the argument loses its kind of force, right? Because that's a move open to everybody too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that points to one really important kind of dialectical strategy in all this. It's like the symmetry, right? Like like we were saying that throughout this entire discussion, we've been trying to provide like symmetry objections and then symmetry breakers and things like that, right? So remember we were saying how someone might say that they can make do with another PSR, which is like the non-first PSR, and then we were pointing out certain asymmetries there between the two principles, namely internal probabilistic tension that one faces that the other doesn't, and so on. And so we are pinpointing asymmetries there, and now we're kind of bringing back the method of kind of symmetries and asymmetries, and how a problem for everyone is a problem for no one, and so on. So I think that's a very important thing when it comes to not only philosophy in general, but also in particular God debates and cosmological arguments and things like
Yeah, I
that.
think there is another modal collapse problem for humanists, that the initial necessary being has to be necessary in all its properties, because then you would really seem to get kind of modal collapse, because then you have something like the god of classical theism who is simply one act of being, and then you have a hard time getting around the fact that one may think that a difference in a fact presupposes a difference in the cause, and then you get to the fact that, well, if the cause is necessary, then you will have in the end just one possible world.
Yeah. So people who follow my blog know that I recently made a big announcement with respect to my second book that I wrote. And on one of the chapters, I go into this kind of argument in great depth. I talk about the kind of difference principle that you were saying. I ultimately adopt a second principle, which is more modest than that, and it's compatible with indeterministic causation. Um, and then I argue that neoclassical theism and other views are going to have a better chance at explaining differences across worlds than views like classical theism, where you just have this one pure act of being, which doesn't vary, but yet it can give rise to literally any possible world, no matter what, without any differential factoring into the exponents. And what's part of the problem there is that under classical theism, everything in God is numerically identical with God. And so God can't have a multiplicity of reasons and desires for which he acts. But whereas under neoclassical theism, God can have that kind of multiplicity of reasons and desires and reason strengths and desire strengths and so on. And those, although they indeterministically explain God's free choices across worlds, they nevertheless can provide a kind of an intelligibility there with respect to the differences across worlds, the differences in God's acts and the differences in creation. And that kind of intelligibility explanation is not going to be available, it seems, to the classical theists, because they don't have these kinds of differential reasons or desires that factor into the explanation across worlds. So, I mean, yeah, I mean,
it is often argued that God's creative act need not be contingent. It only needs to contingently bring about its effect. But what is a creative act that doesn't bring about anything? And if you just say God has to create, well, then he's not self-sufficient in this sense. So I found this actually weird, but if there's a creative act, something has to be created. Otherwise, this is just babble.
Well, this points to another thing that I develop in the chapter that I'm talking about. So I develop what I call a new extension of the modal collapse argument, and it's from providential collapse. And I think what you're pointing to kind of gestures towards providential collapse, right? So in order to avoid modal collapse, they have to say that there's this one absolutely simple necessary act with which God is identical, and yet still every possible world, you can fix all the facts about God. All the facts about God you can fix. Everything about God you can fix, and yet that still leaves open any possible world out of the infinitely many. In fact, Alexander Pruss has argued that possible worlds are so numerous so as to be beyond cardinality. Out of every possible world, you can still get any one of those, setting every fact about God fixed. In which case,
because you can't restrict it, right?
Yeah, it can't. There's no.
You don't have the two necessary tools, right?
Yeah. Well, and what that means is that it seems as though it's impossible to give any kind of content to what God's divine providence consists in, because there isn't any distinctive act by which God brings about any particular universe. He doesn't have any intention that is distinctly oriented towards some particular state of affairs in particular. he doesn't have like nothing. You can fix everything about him, and yet it seems to be just a lottery which world out of the infinitely many comes to be, because everything about God is utterly numerically identical across all such worlds. And given that these things are possible, they could each genuinely come about. And God doesn't perform any distinctive act or any distinctive intentions by which he brings about the precise contents of creation and any particular creation. And that seems to just destroy his providence. He doesn't have this distinct plan for the world because everything about him would have been different had the world been different. It just seems to make providence unintelligible. And I make this much more rigorous and formal in the chapter that I'm talking about. But I think that's ultimately the heart of, or at least that's part of the heart of the modal collapse debate, because in your video on modal collapse and classical theism, I remember watching that, and at the end you were just expressing like, listen, surely it's part of the very nature of intentional action to be goal-directed, towards a specific target aim, right? But under classical theism, we have an intentional act, or an apparently intentional act, which not only isn't goal-directed towards a particular definite state of affairs, it's literally compatible with any possible state of affairs whatsoever. And so it's very mysterious, if not utterly unintelligible, as to how this could count as a providential act, an intentional act that is, you know, what we normally take to be an intentional act. It just seems. Anyway, sorry, I've been ranting for a while, but
I see. But normally they say God's act of creation is not contingent, just as effect. But if there is an act of creation, God is not self-sufficient. He cannot remain in his initial state because there's a necessary act of creation. And normally, if we talk about the doctrine of creation, we would normally hold that God could have remained in its initial state. Otherwise, how is he impassible? How is he self-sufficient? I don't see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, there are definitely lots of problems with affirming modal collapse. We probably don't want to do that, but.
Because anyway, some people can bite the bullet, right? But
yeah, Kate Rogers.
For Christians, it's kind of hard.
I had her on my channel. She bites the bullet. She says, "Yep, modal collapse. Deal with it." That's what she says. But I guess before we end this, maybe we can just talk about some other stage 2 inferences that you want to talk about. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so as I understand Rasmussen, he thinks that since God has these omni-properties that are just unlimited, so omniscience is knowing the truth value of every proposition, omnipotence is just being able to perform every kind of logically possible actions. He thinks that these are kind of more in line with a necessary being than some kind of arbitrary, like if God had some kind of quantity out of all the natural numbers, and that would be in itself so contingent that it's in some sense improbable and is not really in line with the proposition that a necessary being exists.
Yeah, I've always found this line of reasoning really interesting, and I've been planning to get Paul Draper and Josh Rasmussen on my channel to discuss limits and the intrinsic probability of the hypotheses on the table.
Doesn't this also come from the kind of scholastic principle that the cause is in some sense greater than its effect? So this doesn't follow, but it sort of weakly implies that what is uncaused is unlimited in this sense.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't made that.
Unlimited in greatness.
Yeah, I hadn't made that connection. That's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't say that it gets you to unlimited. It just only needs to be greater than the greatest thing that is created, right? But
yes, but it's sort of in this sense, surely that it's greater than doesn't mean that it's perfectly great, right? But if they see that being caused is the limitation, brings about the limitation in greatness, then what is uncaused is in this sense unlimited in greatness. I think they would probably argue something like that.
Yeah, well, and the principle also seems dubious. I mean, like the butterfly.
What does it mean for things in quantum mechanics or something like that to be greater? I never understood that.
Yeah, well, and the butterfly effect, where you just have this like very tiny perturbation and there's like volcano.
The flapping of the wings of some butterfly is in some sense greater than the storm. I mean, I don't even know what it means to say that a storm has any greatness. But.
Yeah, and I mean they have responses to those, but we could set those aside. I do want to discuss the limit sort of thing. So I guess one response that is interesting is that I agree that picking some particular finite degreed limited value of a property is going to be less intrinsically probable than having that property to an unlimited degree. So I will admit that. And actually, the reason goes down to the probabilistic tension that I was that Paul Draper and Swinburne that they develop. It's precisely because you have this much power that gives you reason to expect that it has more power. In which case, if you're making that internal proviso, it's less simple and it has internal tension. So I agree that any particular value for the limit, that's going to be a hypothesis that postulates that is going to be less intrinsically probable than a hypothesis that postulates an unlimited value. But
the problem is,
the thing,
once again, I just want to hang interest on, if we're talking about power, well, power is about what is possible to bring about, but if what is possibly follows from the nature of the initial state, then the initial state is going to be unlimited power by definition.
At least, yeah.
You can talk about different senses of possibility, conceptual possibility, but if we're really talking about modal possibility, surely everything that is possible follows from the initial necessary state.
Well,
so then it's going to be unlimited by definition.
Yeah, well, Aristotelians are going to love that because they're going to say, yes, anything that, if there is indeed an initial state, well then anything that's possible could only be possible in virtue of its direct or indirect causal power. But under other views of possibility, you actually might not be able to get that inference because you might have something that's initial in this world, but that's not initial in another world. And
yes, but if we already accept that we have argued to this kind of initial state, then maybe we could take this kind of view for granted.
Yeah. So I agree with you there. But I would never describe that as omnipotence because we're talking about direct or indirect power. So like, sure,
we're talking about intentionality there.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't have, in the normal sense of power, it does not have the power to produce a burger. It would only have the power to produce the succeeding state of reality, say, and then that would have the power to produce the next one. And then, maybe 13.8 billion years later, something comes to have the power of directly producing a burger. And so you can say indirectly that the initial state had the indirect causal power producing a burger, but that's so far from omnipotence that, But okay.
But then we have to if omnipotence is not only on the table for some view, why we're talking about limits then? I mean,
that's good. Well, I mean, I did want to go back to my point about limits. Is that I agree that any particular proposal that posits a specific limit, that's going to be less intrinsically probable than a hypothesis that says it lacks limits altogether. It's unlimited, but we don't have to have those two particular proposals, right? We don't have to specify that it has some particular limited value. Rather, we can just say it has some limit or other, right? It has some limit or other. It's limited in some way or other. And that's actually going to be much more intrinsically probable than saying that it has unlimited, its value is unlimited in respect to the property P in question, right? Because there's only one possible way to lack a limit with respect to degree to property P, but there are at least usually infinitely many ways that something can have some limit or other, right? It can have 13 units, 14 units, 15 units, 16, all the way, and there's only one way it can have infinitely many. It can be unlimited. And so then a priori, intrinsically speaking,
if that's one of the possibilities, then you take every kind of value and add unlimited to it, and then it's just, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and the hypothesis, right? We don't have to compare a hypothesis that specifies some particular value that the thing has versus a hypothesis on which it has unlimited value, but rather the two hypotheses can be unlimited and limited, right? And on those, the hypothesis of unlimited is very intrinsically improbable compared to this one, because this one, there are infinitely many ways to be limited. There's only one way to be unlimited. And so even if each particular proposal in this probability space is less probable than the unlimited one, the plurality of them, right? If you're just specifying that it has some limit or other, that's going to be much more probable than if it has unlimited.
Yes.
And things get a little worse if you say that not only is it unlimited in this particular property, but it's unlimited in all of its properties, because then you can do this probability assessment for each of the properties in question, and it gets even more improbable that you could have a being that is unlimited in respect of all of its properties versus something which has some limit or other with respect to some property or other.
Yeah, I think we should rather talk about what's fundamental, because talking about limits but not even clarifying to what kind of properties these limits could possibly apply is a little bit vacuous, I think.
That's interesting. I mean, there's also,
So you're saying a physical state cannot really be omnipotent, right? And so to say, every personal state is at least possibly omnipotent. So we're talking about apples and oranges here. So in which kind of way do limits apply in this?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I like that thing. So that's a really good point. So there are different ways.
Because Graham Oppie and George Rasmussen discussed this, and they ended up talking about if consciousness is more fundamental or materiality in this sense. So
Yeah, that exactly. That points to the fact that there are different ways to lack limits with respect to some property. You can lack a limit with respect to a property P by having that property to an unlimited degree, but you can also lack a limit with respect to property P by being the kind of thing to which property P is
yeah,
not even possibly applied.
essences, I think, kind of determine what kind of properties you can even have. And
Yeah.
then talking about limits is kind of, if you have two states that are in essence identical, you could make that argument, but we are trying to determine what kind of state this is by its very nature. So we're talking about two very distinct things. So limits don't really. I mean, it would probably be of kind of use to say, well, we have an omnipotent God, or we have a God that lacks some kind of powers, and then we could say maybe the omnipotent God is the more probable in this sense. But if we're really talking about non-personal initial states and personal initial states, or personal necessary beings and impersonal necessary beings, I don't think the argument gets us very far.
Yeah, I mean, because again, like the impersonal thing is going to be the kind of thing which is such that these properties, or a lot of the properties in question, aren't even applicable, and hence it's lacking limits with respect to those properties, but precisely because it's not the kind of thing that can have them in the first place.
Yeah, that. Or
Okay.
if you take it a step further, you would actually have to say that it's a kind of material state that is also conscious. And then it can have all these properties, and it can hold them all limitless. But what you're getting, I mean,
Yeah, well, and there's the problem of the fundamental aspects of this thing and the non-fundamental aspects of this thing, right? So when you bring up the problem of Trinitarianism and how that's a limited number of persons, they often say that, oh, well, there's somewhat that being Trinitarian is not fundamental to God. Rather, he fundamentally lacks limits. And then the limits that he has are explained in terms of more fundamental things about God that are unlimited. And, well, I want to know what you think about that. I have a lot of reservations about that, but...
everything about the Trinity is philosophically so complicated and so counterintuitive. I would take a line that if you believe that God is triune, you should probably hold that belief on the basis of revelation, and probably accept that if already such a higher reality as God exists, then there are things that are simply not intelligible or understandable by the human mind. And you would have an interesting basis for this, because God exists in such a different way in this that you may not be able to make any kind of clear references. The problem that it is, of course, they want to affirm this in the sense of a creed, right? In the case of a proposition, but logically inconsistent propositions do not really refer to anything. So I have a problem with the Trinity there too, because I think the formulations of it are mostly logically incoherent and cannot be really made coherent. So I'm
Yeah,
not sure how you pack the Trinity into this, and I don't think that God has a kind of form. I don't even think that it really makes sense to think of God. What is its God existence logically prior, in some sense, to the Trinity?
yeah. See, so that's one of my difficulties. I'm just like, well, hold on a second. Like, you're telling me that being Trinitarian is not fundamental to God? I was just like, what? Like, that almost sounds heretical, but I don't
It's a
know.
coinky dink.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so that does kind of surprise me. But also, well, another thing is like, if you have these more fundamental facts about God, um, these more fundamental things that are doing the explanatory work with respect to the Trinity or the Trinitarian persons, I don't know. It seems like, how are they divine then? Because surely God is supposed to be the most fundamental thing, but if these things are non-fundamental, there's something more fundamental than them, then how are they divine? I mean, like,
Do
I
you
don't know.
think that there is some kind of necessary entailment that leads to the number 3?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are certain arguments for that. I mean, I don't find them all too plausible. But even if they do have the arguments, right, there's still the problem of if we're saying that every limit is such that it can't be fundamental, then they're going to have to say, firstly, that being Trinitarian is not fundamental to God. That's already unintuitive. Secondly, it seems as though they're going to have to. I mean, this is fine by me, but they're going to have to deny divine simplicity because you have a more fundamental layer of God that's somehow explanatorily undergirding this less fundamental layer of God. So you have these kinds of, I mean, that's obviously not compatible with divine simplicity. The third thing is that it seems as though the naturalists can then say, oh, well, the foundational reality is limited in a whole host of respects, but, oh, fundamentally speaking, it's just unlimited, it's unlimited, or it lacks certain limits, and that explains why it's limited in all these other regards, like perhaps it's spatially limited and super limited in its power, but oh, fundamentally speaking, it doesn't have limits, and it explains those. And so I don't know, it seems as though it gives kind of fodder for the naturalist, as it were. And then the fourth response that I want to make to that is that I don't know, it just seems to me that if the kind of being Trinitarian is not fundamental, I don't know, it's hard for me to see then how each of the persons are, or at least how each of the persons are divine, because surely a divine thing is supposed to be a fundamental thing. But if we're saying that being Trinitarian, and hence the threeness, there being three persons, is not fundamental, how are they divine if they're not fundamental? Because being divine, being fundamental is constitutive of being divine, it seems. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also the argument of Gelman for the unity of the first clause, because if you can pit sort of omnipotent necessary beings against each other, you get kind of modal nonsense. You cannot no longer really explain where a certain fact does not obtain, and who is actually responsible for that. In what way can a proposition be true, made true by one of them, and made true by the inactivity of the other thing? It's but I never understood how, in this kind of circle that he creates, how he actually gets to the necessity of a necessary being omnipotent in the first place. I read that in Prusa's article, and I kind of understood that it makes a good case against several or a multitude of omnipotent necessary beings, but I never understood how this actually gets you to omnipotence in the first place.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I think they use an operationalized definition of omnipotence, and they say that suppose we get in stage one at least one thing which is such that it explains all contingent truths in reality. I think that's, and they're going to say, okay,
I think
fine.
that they start from the fact that if you are able to bring it about, that you're able to bring it about, this kind of transitivity, then you're just able to bring it about, right?
Yeah, they do say that you have to have that transitivity condition of potentiality. So if X potentially, if X has the potentiality to bring about Y and Y has the potentiality to bring about Z, well then X itself has the potentiality to bring about Z. So it's that transitivity. And I think that, well, like we were saying, I think there are difficulties here in this definition of omnipotence, and it might actually pose problems for the argument itself, because there's this distinction between the direct and indirect powers of the thing. And, it goes back to the burger example that I gave. Like, yes. I think it's very unintuitive to say that the initial singularity, say, if we're just operating on a kind of Oppian view, that has the power to make burgers. Like, no, it doesn't. I mean, sure, like indirectly, it can initiate a causal chain, which is such that in 13.8 billion years, burgers might.
In the case of God, it's some kind of occasionalism, right? I mean, are there causal powers and things distinct from God, or is it just puppeteering or something like that?
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot. Do you have any final words that maybe overall?
I enjoyed this greatly, and I hope some people have actually gained something from that, and if it's only interest.
Yeah. I mean, I find this stuff like intrinsically fascinating and interesting in its own right. For the audience, we're not trying to like polemically pick any side, and we're not trying to like
Not really.
bash views. This conversation has been like explorative, really. We're just been exploring certain views and objections to them and so
And
on.
there is so much written about this anyway. You can't, neither can
Yeah.
you really read it all or just present it all. I always forget, and I don't remember things I read 5 years ago. So
I know, it's so unfortunate. Like I was just talking about like the year and a half ago where I read this paper, and I'm just like, I'm straining to remember it. It's unfortunate, but you know, we're finite. We got arbitrary limits.
we do. Yeah, there was so much great stuff in there. Maybe we could just point out the papers that we have discussed. Proust's Leibnizian argument, the Gale and Proust argument, they're all online and they're for free because Alexander Proust's most papers, I think, are on his website. You can just look them up. You can just type it in. They're the first hits, actually. So read it for yourself.
Yeah, and well, I don't think the book Necessary Existence is online for free, but definitely pick up that book and check it out for
I thought
that.
there was some paper about the modal argument from beginnings that was actually for free online.
Yeah, Josh.
Not a paper, I think, but some kind of summary of it was online.
Oh, someone did do a YouTube video reading through it and so on. Okay, anyway,
Yes?
we're going on. Thank you for coming on. Everyone definitely check out Elephant Philosophy on YouTube. He and I are thinking about making a dual YouTube channel and kind of on a more popular level, less
Meaner.
like super rigorous. Yeah, meaner. Yep, exactly. But we'll keep you updated with that. And what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason. And peace out.